Thomas Bennett sat in his old wooden chair on the porch of his small ranch house at 67 years old. He was tired, very tired. The doctor had given him the news 6 months ago. His heart was failing, and he had maybe a year left to live. The morning sun was just starting to rise over the rolling hills of Yorkshire. Thomas held his cup of tea with both hands to keep them warm. The steam rose from the cup like tiny clouds disappearing into the cold air. He watched the golden light spread across his land and tried to remember when he had last felt truly happy. Thomas had never married. He had come close once. When he was 35, there was a woman named Margaret who worked at the village library. She had kind eyes and a gentle smile. They had gone on 3 dates, but Thomas could never find the right words to say. He was too shy, too afraid of saying something wrong. Eventually, Margaret married the baker's son, and Thomas went back to his quiet life alone. He had no children. His parents were long gone. His mother died when he was 40, and his father passed 5 years later. His only brother, William, had died 3 years earlier from the same heart problems that were now killing Thomas. William had lived in London with his wife and 2 daughters, but they rarely visited the ranch. After William's funeral, Thomas never heard from them again. The ranch had been in the Bennett family for 50 years. Thomas's father had bought the land with money saved from working in the coal mines. It was not a big ranch, just 20 acres, with a small house, a barn, and enough space for some cattle and chickens. But it had been home for Thomas his whole life. Now the ranch was too much for him to handle alone. The fence posts were falling down, and he did not have the strength to fix them. 3 of his cattle had wandered off last month because of the broken fence. The roof of the barn was leaking, and every time it rained, more water got inside. The bills kept coming, but the money was running out. His heart medicine cost more than he made selling eggs and milk to the village market. Every morning, Thomas would sit on his porch and drink his tea. He would watch the sunrise and think about what would happen to his land when he was gone. The bank would probably take it. They had already sent him 2 letters asking about late payments. All those years of hard work would mean nothing. Some stranger would buy his family's land and maybe tear down the house his father had built with his own hands. His neighbors, Jack and Emma Thompson, would stop by sometimes to check on him. They lived on the next farm over, about half a mile down the dirt road. They were kind people with warm hearts. Emma would bring him soup when he was feeling sick, and Jack would help with small repairs round the house. They had 3 young children who would wave to Thomas from their car when they drove past his ranch. But Thomas could see the worry in their eyes when they looked at him. They knew he was struggling, but they had their own family to care for. Jack worked long hours at the grain mill in town. Emma was busy with the children and their own farm. Thomas did not want to be a burden to anyone. "I'm going to die alone," Thomas whispered to himself one evening as he watched the stars appear in the dark sky. The words felt heavy in his mouth, just like my father said I would. Thomas remembered his father's words from many years ago. "You're too quiet, boy," his father had said after Thomas came home from another failed attempt at making friends at school. "If you don't learn to talk to people, you'll end up old and alone with nobody to care if you live or die." His father had not meant to be cruel. He was trying to help Thomas become more social, but the words had stuck in Thomas's mind for 30 years, every time he felt lonely. He heard his father's voice saying those words. Thomas had always been quiet and shy, even as a child. He found it hard to make friends or talk to people. Other children would play together at school, but Thomas would sit alone and read books. When he grew up, He discovered that work was easier than relationships animals were, easier than people. Cows and chickens did not judge him for being quiet. They did not care if he said the wrong thing or if he was not good at telling jokes. But now, in his final months, the loneliness felt like a heavy stone in his chest. When he woke up in the morning, there was no one to say good morning to. When he ate his meals, there was no one to share them with. When he went to bed at night, there was no one to say good night to. The silence in his house was so complete that sometimes he would talk to his old dog, Buster, just to hear a voice. But Buster had died 2 years ago. He had made peace with it. Some people were meant to have big families and lots of love. Others, like him, were meant to live quietly and fade away without anyone noticing. That was just how life worked. Some flowers grew in big, beautiful gardens with lots of attention. Others grew alone by the side of the road and bloomed quietly, where no one could see them. Thomas finished his tea and stood up slowly from his chair. His chest felt tight, and he had to hold onto the porch railing to keep his balance. Tomorrow, he would need to drive to town to get his hard medicine. He did not like going to town because it reminded him how alone he was. All around him, he would see families shopping together, friends talking and laughing, couples holding hands. It made his loneliness feel even heavier. But Thomas did not know that his life was about to change in a way he could never imagine. Tomorrow's trip to town would be different from all the others. Tomorrow, he would meet someone who would change everything. Thomas rarely went to town anymore. His old red truck was 20 years old and used too much petrol. Every trip cost him money he did not have. But this Tuesday morning was different. He had no choice. Dr. Williams had called yesterday to say his heart pills were ready at the pharmacy. Without those pills, Thomas knew his weak heart would give up even sooner. The morning air was cold as Thomas climbed into his truck. The engine made strange noises when he started it, like an old man coughing. Thomas hoped it would not break down on the road. He could not afford to call someone to fix it or tow it back home. The drive to Millbrook village took 20 minutes. On the winding country roads, Thomas had to drive slowly because the roads were narrow and full of turns. He passed green fields with sheep and cows, old stone walls, and farmhouses with smoke coming from their chimneys. On better days, he would have enjoyed the beautiful countryside. Today, he just wanted to get his medicine and go home. Millbrook was a small village with one main street. There was Harper's Pharmacy, a post office, a small grocery store, and a pub called the Red Lion. Most of the other buildings were old houses with flower gardens in front. Thomas parked his truck outside the pharmacy and turned off the engine. It made one last cough, and then went quiet. Thomas walked slowly down the main street toward the pharmacy. His chest felt tight, like someone was squeezing it with their hands. He had to stop twice to catch his breath. An elderly woman walking her small dog looked at him with concern. But Thomas just smiled and nodded to show he was all right. The pharmacy was busy. Thomas had to wait in line behind a young mother with 2 small children and an old man buying bandages. When it was finally his turn, Mrs. Harper behind the counter smiled at him kindly. "Good morning, Mr. Bennet," she said. "Dr. Williams called. About your medicine. How are you feeling today?" "I'm managing. Thank you," Thomas replied quietly. He paid for his pills and put them in his coat pocket. The small bottle felt heavy, like it was carrying the weight of his remaining days. As Thomas walked back toward his truck, he decided to take a longer route. He had not been to town in 3 weeks, and he wanted to see if anything had changed. He walked past the post office and turned the corner near the old train station. The train station had been closed for 15 years. The building was falling apart, with broken windows and weeds growing through cracks in the platform. Behind it were several empty warehouses that used to store grain and supplies. Now, they were just dark, forgotten buildings that nobody used anymore. As Thomas walked past these empty buildings, he saw something that made him stop completely. A young girl, maybe 15 or 16 years old, was sitting on the ground near one of the warehouses. She was leaning against a brick wall, and even from a distance, Thomas could see that she looked scared and tired. The girl had long brown hair that was tangled and dirty. Her clothes were wrinkled and stained, like she had been sleeping outside. But what made Thomas's heart skip a beat was what he saw round her wrists. Her hands were tied together with thick rope, and the rope looked tight and painful. Two men stood about 10 feet away from the girl. They were talking in loud, angry voices. Thomas could not hear their exact words, but their tone was harsh and threatening. Both men were big and rough-looking. One had a thick beard and wore a dirty leather jacket. The other was bald and had tattoos covering his arms. They looked like the kind of men who would hurt someone without thinking twice about it. The girl looked up and saw Thomas watching from across the street. Their eyes met for just a moment, but in that short time, Thomas saw everything he needed to see. Her eyes were full of fear, like a small animal trapped in a cage. But there was also something else in her eyes, hope. She was looking at him like he might be able to save her. Thomas felt his heart beating fast, but not from his illness this time. Something was very wrong here. This young girl was in terrible danger, and she needed help immediately. But what could an old, sick man like him do against a strong, dangerous man? The men noticed Thomas looking at them. The one with the beard started walking toward him with angry steps. His face was twisted with rage, and his hands were clenched into fists. "Move along, old man," the bearded man said in a threatening voice when he got close to Thomas. "Nothing here for you to see. Mind your own business and keep walking." Thomas felt fear rise in his throat like cold water. His hands started shaking, and his knees felt weak. He had never been a brave man, and he had never been in a fight in his entire life. These men looked like they could hurt him very badly without even trying hard. "I was just walking to my truck," Thomas said quietly, trying to keep his voice steady. He nodded toward his old red truck parked down the street. "Then, walk faster," the bald man called out from where he stood near the girl, "and forget what you think you saw." Thomas nodded and walked away as quickly as his weak legs could carry him. But his hands were shaking so badly he could barely get his truck keys out of his pocket. He climbed into his truck and started the engine, but he could not stop looking back toward the empty buildings where the girl was sitting. He drove home in a daze, barely paying attention to the winding roads. When he got back to his ranch, he went straight to his kitchen and made a cup of tea, but his hands were still shaking so much that he spilled hot water on the counter. Thomas sat at his kitchen table and tried to eat lunch, but he had no appetite. He kept thinking about the girl's eyes. Those eyes were asking for help, begging for someone to save her. She was just a child, probably younger than his neighbor's oldest daughter. What were those men doing to her? Where were her parents? Why was nobody looking for her? That afternoon, Thomas tried to do his usual work around the ranch. He fed his chickens and checked on his two remaining cows, but he could not concentrate on anything. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw the girl's face and her frightened eyes. As the sun began to set, Thomas sat on his porch with another cup of tea. But instead of watching the beautiful sunset like he usually did, he stared down the dirt road toward town. Somewhere out there, that young girl was still in danger. Those rough men probably had her locked up somewhere, doing terrible things to her. Thomas had never been a brave man, but something inside him was changing. Maybe it was because he did not have much time left to live. Maybe it was because he had nothing left to lose. Or maybe it was because, for the first time in his life, someone needed him to be brave. That night, Thomas could not sleep. He lay in his bed and stared at the ceiling, thinking about the girl. Where was she now? Was she safe? Was she crying? Was she hoping that the old man she had seen would come back to help her at midnight? Thomas made a decision that surprised even himself. He got out of bed and put on his clothes. His heart was beating fast with fear and determination. He had spent his whole life being quiet and safe, never taking risks or standing up for anything. But tonight was going to be different. Thomas grabbed his truck keys and a flashlight from the kitchen drawer. He was going back to town. Thomas parked his truck far from the old train station. The clock on his dashboard showed 12:30 in the morning. The streets of Millbrook were completely empty and dark. All the shops were closed, and most of the street lights had burned out years ago. Thomas turned off his truck's engine and sat in the darkness for a moment, trying to calm his racing heart. He had never done anything like this before in his entire life. Thomas was the kind of man who followed rules and never caused trouble. He paid his bills on time, drove slowly, and always said please and thank you. But tonight, something deep inside him had changed. Tonight, he was going to break the rules to save someone who needed help. Thomas took his flashlight from the seat beside him but did not turn it on yet. The light would make him easy to see, and he needed to stay hidden. He got out of his truck quietly and closed the door as softly as possible. The night air was cold against his face, and his breath made small white clouds in the darkness. He walked carefully through the shadows, staying close to the buildings so no one could see him from the street. His heart was pounding so hard he thought everyone in the village might be able to hear it. Every few steps, he had to stop and catch his breath. His weak heart was not used to this kind of excitement and fear. The old train station looked even more frightening in the darkness. The broken windows were like empty eyes staring at him. Weeds and small trees had grown up round the building, making it look like something from a scary story. Behind the station, the empty warehouses stood like sleeping giants in the night. Thomas moved slowly toward the warehouses, trying not to make any noise. The ground was covered with broken glass, old papers, and pieces of metal. Every step seemed to make a sound, and Thomas was sure the men would hear him coming. Then he heard it, a soft crying sound coming from inside one of the warehouses. The sound was so quiet that Thomas almost missed it. It was the sound of someone trying to cry without making noise, the way children cry when they are afraid someone will hurt them for being too loud. Thomas felt his chest tighten, but not from his heart problem. He felt angry and sad at the same time. This was a child in there, scared and alone, and those terrible men had hurt her. Thomas had never felt so angry in his entire life. He walked round the warehouse until he found a broken window near the back. The glass had been broken long ago, and most of it had fallen out. Thomas looked through the window and turned on his flashlight for just a second. There she was. The young girl was sitting on the cold concrete floor in the corner of the empty warehouse. Her hands were still tied together with the same thick rope Thomas had seen earlier. But now there was also a heavy chain round her ankle. The chain was connected to a metal pipe on the wall, so she could not move very far. The girl looked even smaller and more frightened than she had that morning. Her brown hair was messy, and there were tears on her cheeks. She had her knees pulled up to her chest and was rocking back and forth slowly, the way people do when they are trying to comfort themselves. The men were not there, but Thomas knew they would come back soon. He had to act fast. He looked round the outside of the warehouse until he found a loose board in the wall. The wood was old and rotting, and when Thomas pulled on it, it moved. He worked quietly to make the gap bigger until he could squeeze through. Getting through the gap was harder than Thomas had expected. He was not a big man, but he was 67 years old, and his body did not bend and move the way it used to. The rough wood scratched his arms and tore his shirt. His chest hurt from the effort, and he had to bite his lip to keep from making noise. But he kept going because the girl needed him. Once he was inside the warehouse, Thomas turned on his flashlight and pointed it toward the floor so it would not be too bright. He walked slowly toward the corner where the girl was sitting. "Don't be afraid," Thomas whispered as he got closer to her. "I'm here to help you. I saw you this morning. Remember, I came back for you." The girl looked at him with wide eyes. In the light from his flashlight, Thomas could see that she was even younger than he had thought, maybe 14 or 15 years old. She had brown hair and green eyes that reminded him of his mother when she was young. The girl was shaking, partly from cold and partly from fear. Thomas knelt down beside her, moving slowly so he would not scare her more. He took his old pocket knife out of his coat. The knife had belonged to his father, and Thomas had carried it for 30 years. His hands were shaking, and his fingers were not as steady as they used to be, but he managed to cut through the thick ropes around her wrists. The ropes had been tied very tight, and they had left red marks on the girl's skin. Thomas felt angry again when he saw how much the ropes had hurt her. What kind of people would do this to a child? The chain round her ankle was locked with an old padlock. Thomas looked round the warehouse and found a heavy rock near the wall. He used the rock to hit the lock again and again until it finally broke. The sound seemed very loud in the empty warehouse, and Thomas worried that someone might hear it. "Can you walk?" Thomas asked gently as he helped remove the chain from her ankle. The girl nodded, but when she tried to stand up, her legs were too weak and she almost fell down. Thomas caught her arm and helped her stand. She had been sitting in the same position for so long that her legs had gone numb. Thomas could hear voices outside the warehouse. The men were coming back. His heart started beating even faster, and his hands began to shake again. He had to get the girl out of there immediately, or they would both be in terrible danger. Thomas and the girl moved toward the gap in the wall where he had entered the warehouse, but the girl was weak and scared, and she could barely walk. Thomas had to support most of her weight as they moved through the darkness, just before they reached the gap in the wall. The girl stopped walking. She grabbed Thomas's arm with both hands and looked directly into his eyes. Even in the dim light, Thomas could see tears running down her face. "Please," she whispered in a voice so soft that Thomas could barely hear it. "Be my dad." Those four words hit Thomas like lightning striking the ground. This girl, who did not even know his name, was asking him to be her father. She was not asking him to call the police or take her to a safe place. She was asking him to become her family. In that moment, Thomas saw something in the girl's eyes that he had never seen before. She saw something in him that he had never seen in himself. She saw someone who could protect her and care for her. She saw someone who could love her and keep her safe from the terrible things in the world. Thomas felt tears in his own eyes as he looked at this brave, frightened child who had chosen him to be her protector. "I will," Thomas whispered back. I promise I will be your dad." In that moment, everything in Thomas's life changed forever. He was no longer a lonely old man waiting to die alone on his empty ranch. He was no longer someone who had never mattered to anyone. He was someone's father, and someone was depending on him to keep her safe. The voices outside were getting closer, but Thomas was not afraid anymore. He had something to live for now. Thomas helped the girl escape through the broken wall just as the voices outside got closer. They could hear heavy footsteps and angry words getting nearer to the warehouse. Thomas's heart was beating so fast he thought it might stop completely. But he knew he had to get the girl to safety. The girl was still weak from being tied up for so long. Her legs shook as she walked, and Thomas had to help her every step of the way. They moved as quietly as they could through the darkness, staying in the shadows between the old buildings. When they reached Thomas's truck, he helped the girl climb into the passenger seat. She was shivering from cold and fear. Thomas took off his warm coat and wrapped it around her shoulders. It was too big for her small frame, but it would help keep her warm. Thomas started the truck and drove away as quickly as he did. He did not turn on his headlights until they were far from the warehouses. His hands were shaking so badly he could barely hold the steering wheel, but he kept driving. The girl sat beside him in silence, staring out the window with wide, frightened eyes. When they were safely away from the village, Thomas stopped the truck on a quiet country road. He took out his mobile phone and called the police. His voice shook as he told them about the girl and the dangerous men at the warehouses. The police said they would go there immediately. Within an hour, the police had caught both men. They found drugs and other illegal things in the warehouse. The police told Thomas that he had been very brave and that the girl would have been in much worse danger if he had not rescued her. At the police station, Thomas learned the girl's name was Lucy Miller. She was 15 years old, not 14 as he had thought. She had been taken from her foster home in London 3 months ago. Her real parents had died in a terrible car accident when she was 12 years old, and she had no other family to take care of her. The social workers told Thomas a sad story. Lucy had been placed in a foster home that was supposed to be safe and loving. But the people who were supposed to take care of her had been very bad people. Instead of treating her like their own child, they had sold her to the men who took her away. Lucy had been moved from place to place by these criminals, never knowing where she would end up next. Thomas felt angry and sad when he heard Lucy's story. How could adults be so cruel to a child who had already lost so much? Lucy had never done anything wrong, but she had suffered more in her young life than most people suffer in many years. When the police and social workers asked Lucy where she wanted to go, she surprised everyone. She pointed to Thomas and said she wanted to stay with him. She told them that he had saved her life and that she felt safe with him. She said she did not want to go to another foster home where people might hurt her again. Thomas told the police and social workers that he wanted to take care of Lucy. But it was not easy. There were many forms to fill out and many questions to answer. The social workers were worried because Thomas had never been a parent before. He was old and sick. He did not have much money. His house was small and old. How could he take care of a teenage girl? But Lucy spoke up for Thomas every time someone asked these questions. She told everyone that Thomas was the first person who had ever risked his own safety to help her. She said she trusted him more than anyone else in the world. She had never had a real home before, and Thomas's little ranch house felt like heaven to her. The social workers visited Thomas's ranch many times. They asked him questions about his health, his money, and his plans for taking care of Lucy. They wanted to make sure he could provide a good home for her. Thomas answered all their questions honestly. He told them he might not live very long because of his heart problems, but he promised to love and protect Lucy for as long as he could. After 2 months of paperwork, meetings, and visits from social workers, Lucy finally came to live with Thomas. The day she moved to the ranch was the happiest day of Thomas's life. He had cleaned the house from top to bottom and bought new sheets and pillows for the spare bedroom. He had never prepared for a guest before, and he wanted everything to be perfect for Lucy. But the first few weeks were harder than Thomas had expected. Lucy had terrible nightmares almost every night. She would wake up screaming and crying, thinking the bad men had come back to take her away. Thomas would sit beside her bed and talk to her quietly until she felt safe enough to go back too. Lucy was also afraid to go outside alone. She would only leave the house if Thomas was with her. She jumped at every unexpected noise and hid behind Thomas whenever strangers came to the ranch. The terrible things that had happened to her had left deep scars that would take a long time to heal. Thomas did not know how to comfort a frightened teenager. He had never had children of his own, and he felt confused and worried most of the time. But he tried his best to be patient and kind. He learned that sometimes Lucy just needed someone to sit with her quietly. Other times, she wanted to talk about her fears and memories. Thomas listened to everything she said and never told her she should just forget about the bad things that had happened. Slowly, week by week, Thomas and Lucy learned how to be a family. Thomas taught Lucy how to take care of the chickens. She was afraid of them at first because they made sudden movements and loud noises. But Thomas showed her how to move slowly and speak softly to them. Soon Lucy was collecting eggs every morning and talking to the chickens like they were her friends. Thomas also taught Lucy how to grow vegetables in his small garden. She had never grown anything before, and she was amazed when tiny green plants started coming up from the seeds they had planted together. Lucy learned how to water the plants and pull out the weeds. She was especially proud of the tomatoes she grew, which were bigger and redder than any Thomas had ever grown by himself. Lucy helped Thomas with cooking and cleaning. She was a smart girl who learned quickly. Soon she was making breakfast every morning and helping Thomas organize his medicine and doctor appointments. She noticed that Thomas felt better when the house was clean and tidy. So she worked hard to keep everything neat. After a few months, Lucy started going to the village school. Thomas drove her there every morning and picked her up every afternoon. At first, the other children stared at her because she was new and very quiet. Lucy had trouble trusting other young people because of all the bad things that had happened to her, but slowly, Lucy began to make friends. The other students could tell that she was kind and smart. Even though she was shy, Lucy was especially good at helping younger children who were having trouble with their reading. She remembered how scared and alone she had felt, and she wanted to help other children who felt the same way. Thomas discovered something amazing as the months passed. Taking care of Lucy gave him new energy and strength. His heart still hurt, and he still had to take medicine every day. But he felt stronger because he had someone to live for. He had a reason to get up every morning and a reason to take care of himself. Lucy brought laughter and music into Thomas's quiet house. She would sing songs while she worked in the garden, and Thomas would smile as he listened from the porch. She would tell him funny stories from school, and for the first time in years, Thomas found himself laughing out loud. The old ranch started to feel alive again. Thomas and Lucy worked together to fix the broken fence posts and paint the house. Lucy chose a cheerful yellow color for the kitchen walls, and Thomas thought it made the whole house look brighter and happier. They also got a dog from the animal shelter in town. It was a young golden retriever that had been abandoned by his previous owners. Lucy wanted to name the dog Hope because she said that was what Thomas had given her when he rescued her from the warehouse. Hope became Lucy's constant companion. The dog seemed to understand that Lucy had been hurt and needed extra love and protection. Hope would sleep beside Lucy's bed every night and follow her everywhere during the day. Having Hope nearby helped Lucy feel safe and less afraid. As winter turned to spring, Thomas realized that his life had completely changed. He was no longer a lonely old man waiting to die. He was a father, taking care of a daughter who needed him. He had found his purpose in life, and it had given him more joy than he had ever imagined possible. 2 years passed quickly on the little ranch in Yorkshire. Lucy grew taller and stronger with each passing season. She was now 17 years old and had changed from a frightened, broken girl into a confident young woman with bright eyes and a warm smile. She did very well in school, especially in English and history. Her teachers said she was one of the smartest students they had ever taught. Lucy had made many good friends at school. At first, she had been too scared and shy to talk to other young people, but slowly she learned to trust again. Her best friend was a girl named Katie who lived in the village. Katie would often come to the ranch on weekends to help Lucy take care of the animals and work in the garden. Thomas was proud of Lucy every single day. When he watched her feeding the chickens or helping with homework at the kitchen table, his heart felt full of joy. She had healed from a terrible experience and become exactly the kind of person he had always hoped she could be. Kind, strong, and full of hope for the future. But while Lucy was growing stronger, Thomas was getting weaker. His heart problems were getting worse despite all the medicine he took. Some days, he could barely walk from his bedroom to the kitchen without stopping to rest. The doctors at the hospital had told him the truth. He might only have a few months left to live. Thomas was not afraid of dying anymore. For most of his life, death had seemed like a dark, lonely thing that would take him away from the world without anyone caring. But now death felt different. He had lived a life that mattered. He had saved Lucy, and she had saved him right back. He had experienced real love, the kind of love that makes a person feel complete. But Thomas did worry about Lucy. What would happen to her when he was gone? She was still only 17 years old. She needed someone to take care of her until she became an adult. The thought of Lucy being alone in the world again made Thomas feel sick with worry. Lucy knew that Thomas was getting sicker, but she did not want to talk about it. Talking about it made it feel too real and too frightening. Instead, she took care of Thomas just like he had taken care of her during those first difficult months on the ranch. Every morning, Lucy would wake up early to make Thomas his favorite tea. She would bring it to him in bed along with his heart medicine and a slice of toast with honey. She would sit on the edge of his bed and make sure he ate something before starting his day. In the evenings, Lucy would help Thomas walk out to the porch where they would sit together and watch the sun go down over the hills. She would tell him about her day at school, about her friends, about the books she was reading, and about her dreams for the future. Thomas loved these evening talks more than anything else in the world. One cold morning in November, Mrs. Peterson from the social services came to visit the ranch. She was a kind woman who had helped with Lucy's adoption 2 years earlier, but today she looked serious and sad as she sat down at Thomas's kitchen table. "I've been talking to your doctor, Thomas," Mrs. Peterson said gently. "He's concerned about your health. We need to start making plans for Lucy's future, just in case something happens to you." Lucy was in the next room, but she could hear every word. When she heard Mrs. Peterson talking about taking her away from the ranch, Lucy got very upset. She ran to her bedroom and slammed the door. Thomas found Lucy a few minutes later, crying on her bed with her face buried in her pillow. Her shoulders were shaking, and she was making the same quiet crying sounds Thomas remembered from the night he had rescued her from the warehouse. "I don't want to go anywhere else." Lucy sobbed when she saw Thomas sitting down beside her. "You are my dad. This is my home. I don't want to live with strangers again." Thomas felt his own eyes fill with tears as he took Lucy's hand in his. Her hand was so much bigger now than it had been when she was 15, but it still felt small and delicate in his rough, wrinkled fingers. "Lucy," Thomas said gently, "I want you to know something very important. These past years have been the best years of my entire life. You saved me just as much as I saved you that night. You gave me something I never had before, real love and a real family." Lucy looked up at him with tears running down her cheeks. "But I don't want you to die. Dad, I don't want to be alone again." "I know, sweetheart," Thomas said, using the word he had started calling her after she had been living with him for 6 months. "But dying isn't scary for me anymore. I'm not going to die alone like I always thought I would. I have you, and you have given my life more meaning than I ever imagined possible. No matter what happens to my body, you will always be my daughter, and I will always be your father. That kind of love doesn't end when people die." That weekend, Jack and Emma Thompson came to visit the ranch. They had been watching Thomas and Lucy's story from the very beginning. Jack had helped Thomas fix the fence and paint the house. Emma had taught Lucy how to bake bread and had taken her shopping for new clothes when she first came to live on the ranch. Jack and Emma had 3 children of their own, but they had always loved Lucy like she was part of their family. Lucy called them Uncle Jack and Aunt Emma, and their children thought of Lucy as their older sister, Thomas. Emma said as they all sat round the kitchen table drinking tea, "We want you to know that if anything happens to you, Lucy will always have a home with us. She's family to us, and we would be honored to take care of her. But more than that," Jack added, "we want to help you create something special with this ranch. Something that will last long after you're gone." Jack explained their idea. They wanted to help Thomas create a foundation to help other children like Lucy, children who had been hurt and needed safe places to heal, children who needed loving families. Thomas could use his land to create a center where children could stay while they waited for adoption or while they recovered from terrible experiences. Emma had already talked to some people in the village who wanted to help. The local church was willing to donate money. The school wanted to provide teachers for children who had missed too much school. Even Dr. Williams said he would volunteer his time to help children who needed medical care. Thomas smiled through his tears as he listened to the plan. This was better than anything he had ever dreamed. His ranch would not be sold to strangers when he died. Instead, it would become a place of hope for children who needed love and safety, just like Lucy had needed those things 2 years ago. Over the next few months, Thomas worked with Jack and Emma to set up the Thomas Bennett Foundation. Even though he was getting weaker, the project gave him energy and purpose. He wanted to make sure everything was ready before he died. Lucy helped with the planning too. She had ideas about how to make frightened children feel safe and welcome. She knew what it felt like to be scared and alone, and she wanted to make sure other children would never have to feel that way. 6 months later, on a peaceful spring morning, Thomas passed away quietly in his sleep. Lucy was holding his hand when he took his last breath. He looked calm and happy, like someone who had lived a full and meaningful life. He did not die alone, and he did not die forgotten. Today, Lucy is 20 years old. She studies social work at the university in London, but she comes back to the ranch every holiday and every summer. The Thomas Bennett Foundation has helped 37 children find loving homes in its first 3 years. The old ranch house has been expanded into a beautiful center where children can stay while they wait for families or while they heal from difficult experiences. There are now 6 bedrooms, a large kitchen, a library full of books, and a playroom where children can feel safe and happy. Lucy keeps Thomas's picture on her desk in her university room, and she tells every child who comes to the ranch about the man who saved her life by letting her save his. She tells them that the most important families are not always the ones you are born into, but the ones you choose and the ones who choose you. Thomas's legacy lives on in every child who finds hope at the ranch, in every family that is created through adoption, and in every person who learns that it is never too late to make a difference in someone's life. The old man who thought he would die alone became a father to hundreds of children. The girl who was lost in darkness became a light for others to follow. Sometimes the most beautiful families are the ones we choose. And sometimes the greatest love stories begin with the simple words, "Be my dad."